So I met some of you on the first night, and some of you I know already. But my name is Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
This is the hi slide. Hi. And I'm still eating, so bear with me. But maybe that's nice, because we're a really small group, and it's good to be informal and cozy, and maybe we're all just having dinner, talking about social matters. The plan for tonight is that I'm going to talk for like a while, but definitely not for 2 hours, like maybe for 45 minutes to an hour. And then we will play around with one of the protocols I'm going to talk about in more depth, called Secure Scuttlebutt. And if we get to it, we might try to visualize our Secure Scuttlebutt social graph. And also, I want to say that you're all a very different group from diverse backgrounds, and some of you I know have already used Scuttlebutt, and some of you have in fact even seen a version of this presentation that was shorter than the one you're going to hear tonight, like Andre. I feel free to interrupt me with questions, but also if you like already know everything I'm saying, sorry. In terms of me and what I do, I'm an artist and software engineer. I'm working here in Berlin with Saraswati, actually, on a project called Circles UBI that will be highly relevant to what we're going to talk about. And it's a blockchain-based universal basic income pilot. But I also sometimes like to describe it as an alternative currency that has wealth redistribution built in as one of its mechanisms. We'll talk a little bit more about it later on too. Prior to this, I worked for a couple years at a large blockchain company. And prior to that, like Angie said, I was at a program called Recurse Center, which I would highly recommend to any of you. And I know Kawako just finished it too, and can also talk about what it's like if you're curious.
What about prior to that?
What's that?
What prior to that?
Prior to that, I worked in manufacturing. Cool. I also co-organized this conference. It's about all aspects of the distributed peer-to-peer web, kind of from mesh network up to application layer. It takes place every year in Toronto. Our conference theme this year was RE. So we have all these words that start with RE. And there's kind of like a pattern, like a etymological root there. So if this should interest you, it will happen sometime in 2020, again, in North America. I'm gonna take this bite of food and time up.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Sorry.
Please do this at any point.
Can you tell me about RE in this context and what, like, I don't know if you, what the thread was in terms of the RE logic?
I mean, a lot of the words that start with RE are like either responding to something or yeah, it's like hard to describe what it even is without using the word RE, but like taking something and making it new or reacting or replying or like all of these words, right? And so when you like look at them all in combination, we were arguing, we were like, what do we want to be? Do we want to be like infrastructures of resistance or infrastructures of regeneration or infrastructures of repair? And we like couldn't decide, and we were like, wait a minute, all of these words start with RE. So maybe there's like a common thread, and maybe we want to like think about all of them, like replying to infrastructures maybe, or like replying to infrastructures by building our own or trying to, yeah, anyway.
Thanks.
Cool, I hope that made sense. So anyway, this is our agenda for the talk portion. First we'll talk about what is a social network, then network paradigms in peer-to-peer, and then what we can do with trust in computing. First off, what is a social network? I feel like you already know. But another way to look at or think about a social network is what is the network part. So this is another way to look at what's going on in Facebook. And it's a diagram of someone's friend clusters and who they're all connected to by these relationships. And maybe in a way it's more true because this is what Facebook sees about us. It's not sort of the visible layer. And also I think that even Facebook sort of knows this, because if you look at the diagram on the first page of Facebook, it's very similar. These little people. And this type of diagram and data structure has a name that might be familiar to you, especially if you have a background in computer science. It's called a graph, which is the data structure that shows a network made up of nodes and edges. It can be undirected, like this one. So in this version of the graph, there's an arrow pointing from each little guy to each other little guy, or it can be directed. So in this graph, some of these connections are reciprocated, but not all of them. And a good metaphor for this is on more familiar social media networks, UIs. On some of them, friendship is bidirectional, like Facebook. On others, it's more of a followed concept, like Instagram or Twitter. And this may seem like a really obvious way to think of social connections now in 2019, when we're all very familiar with it. But it's actually kind of interesting that this had to be discovered. So we didn't always understand our relationships this way. The idea of a social network was first introduced in 1954, and it comes from anthropology. Maybe, there's like an interrelationship between different branches of science, and certain things had to happen in computing for us to even think about modeling networks this way. This paper is from the 1970s, and it discusses pretty extensively what is still a problem today when we're trying to model these social networks, which is we build these models, but do they hold up in terms of our field research? So every social media network is coercing human connections into these quantifiable metrics and data structures, but do these metrics accurately represent our connections? And how does the existence of these metrics change our connections in the real world? So a graph is a generic data structure, but there are many specific types of graphs. And here are two that we will talk about in more detail. An exponential graph and a small world graph. And the main property of the small world graph is that on average, the length of a path between any two nodes will be shorter than you would expect based on the number of nodes. So we have this pattern of highly connected components leading to shorter paths between them. So you can see sort of they're like circled by the purple in this graph. These nodes have like statistically significant amount of connections. And the exponential graph, that you do not see that pattern. If this were a communication network, these highly connected nodes would be routing more than their fair share of traffic. If this was a friend network, they would be the extroverts. To make it really, really literal or easy to visualize, the lattice graph over here is just about the farthest thing away you can get from a small world graph. So you imagine if you picked like any two nodes on this lattice, you might get nodes that are right beside each other and like 2 hops away, but you also might have to travel 8 or 10 to get to the other side of the graph. Whereas on the small world graph, like no matter which 2 nodes you picked, you're only several hops away.
Sorry, I think I spaced out a second. When you said the extroverts, are they're represented by
the dots with more connections that have the little purple circles around them.
Okay.
Like much more highly connected nodes. This is a little technical, but to dig a little more deeply into the difference between an exponential network and a scale-free network, we define this by the amount of nodes that any other node is connected to across the network. And if we graph them in the exponential network, I'm going to point at the graph. In an exponential network, it's like average number of connections for each node quickly drops off to 0. So very soon, there's like, at this point, what are the chances, probability speaking, for a node to have 6 connections? Infinitesimally small. In the scale-free graph, we have this kind of, you probably heard, or maybe you've heard, things described as a fat tail, or governed by the power law. Anyway, you have probability is still, like, it might happen. One of the other sort of ways to characterize this or think about it is when you look at averages, so the average number of connections per node. In the exponential graph, the average number of connections per node is meaningful, and if you remove any subset of the data, you'll arrive at the same average. Whereas in the scale-free line, if you remove only the top 5 most connected nodes, your average across the network will be very different. So you didn't have to follow all of that necessarily, yeah?
Is this graph theory? Or like what does this fall under?
I don't even know. This comes from a paper I read about network science.
Network science.
Which is really endlessly fascinating to me. I put this in here because I thought some of you might be interested, or some of you might have a math background and like, oh, I have an example. Okay, human height is exponential, right? If you remove the top 10 tallest people in the world, like your average doesn't meaningfully change. Wealth is power law. If you remove the top 10% of the wealthiest people in the world, you have a fundamentally different average for the amount of wealth any person has. That example really like helped it click for me. Okay, and I know at least one presenter has shown you this diagram already. Maybe they all have. This diagram is a meme to me, maybe obviously, because to me it shows up all the time. It's like, it kind of floats through people's slide decks, my own as well. But it like also kind of becomes meaningless with the repetition of seeing it all the time, and like the way we talk about things based on this diagram gets very fuzzy. Anyway, if we were going to try to ground this whole idea of exponential versus scale-free in this diagram, which is familiar to you, the middle network would be a scale-free network, and the love diagram would be an exponential one. Cool. And
Wait, lib would be power?
Okay, lib is like, don't talk about lib for now.
Okay.
Laugh is power law. Love is exponential.
Okay.
This is Facebook. Cool. Why do we care about what I just told you? This is not a social network, it's an airline network. Specifically, it is Delta Airlines flights in the USA. And the same patterns turn up in all kinds of networks. This is just an example, but I think it's very interesting. In airline networks, it's widely studied, and it's called the hub and spoke model. And this is a map of the internet in terms of traffic. So you may have heard 6 degrees of separation, or your Kevin Bacon number, or in mathematics, we calculate our Erdos number. I'm not even sure how you pronounce that. It turns out this phenomenon is real, and it's real because of these scale-free networks. The internet also has its own version of 6 degrees of separation. There was a study that found any site on the internet is only 19 link clicks away from any other website on the internet. So these properties are found in many real-world phenomena, including website navigation menus, electric grids, networks of brain neurons, and of course, social networks amongst people. And if we look closely at these properties of scale-free networks versus exponential networks, and we consider their behavior under 2 types of attack, we'll sort of learn some interesting things about their resilience. So their 2 categories of attack are a random attack, where nodes are just going out across the network, randomly. And the other is a targeted attack, where we are picking deliberately the most connected nodes, or the most important nodes. And in I take a moment to read the graph myself. In a targeted attack, a scale-free network will decrease performance much faster, and a random network will continue the same way. But in the case of random outages, the scale-free network will continue to function for longer. Which is to say that in a targeted attack, where we're picking out hubs consciously, the internet would fall apart faster than this sort of flat peer-to-peer topography of other types of peer-to-peer protocols. But in the case of random outages, the sort of slightly more centralized, highly connected components model is better. And the reason I think this is interesting is because it's a little bit counterintuitive. Like there's sort of a story in the peer-to-peer community that the flatter the topology, the more resilient the network. But it turns out that depends really specifically on what types of threat model you're thinking about. So, I don't know, I just like to be reminded of that. And also, if we look at sort of full network catastrophe, we see kind of a similar thing, where the scale-free network will retain large clumps of connectivity. So this is like networks fragmenting as they're attacked or as they experience outages. So a flat topography will like really quickly break up into these islands, whereas a scale-free network, you'll have sort of a bigger continent that stays connected for longer, which I think is a very, very interesting way to think about network failure.
Is scale free similar to power?
Same thing. So yeah, just things to think about as we build our protocols out. And you can do all kinds of things with these networks. These is my cautionary attitude coming in. One of those things is predictive policing, which I think is very interesting. This is used by the surveillance state to watch our social networks. This is an entire textbook that I have not read about doing network analysis on social graphs. And this is a diagram connecting various gunshot victims in a social graph. So, lots of applications. And, the way that we use data based on networks, especially social networks, is not neutral, as I'm sure you know. So there's sort of a lot of caution to be exercised. You might remember this scandal with Facebook and fake news. And a big feature of this whistleblowing was that they exploited a Facebook feature to not only get the data of the people who took their quizzes, but also from their entire friend network. To round out this first portion, social networks are a specific type of network that goes deeper than user interfaces we may be familiar with. They can be used for all kinds of analytics under the surface, and they can be modeled in various ways. Some of those ways might be beneficial, but also some might require caution. In a peer-to-peer context, what do we find? I think the other presenters have probably explained the way peer-to-peer internet is different from the normal internet, but my cloud is particularly cute. So examples of peer-to-peer protocols: Bitcoin, most blockchains, BitTorrent, one of my actual favorite peer-to-peer protocols, and also things you might not have heard of or used, like DAT and Secure Scuttlebutt. The thing I want to point out here mostly is that peer-to-peer diagram that I drew is designed to look a little familiar, because we've already seen this slide, and it's a graph. There's kind of this beautiful layering that goes on, I think, between how we might think about nodes connecting on a network and how we might think about humans interacting in a social network. We can perform a lot of the same types of computation on them. Maybe you've come across the idea of the internet as a stack of layers, with the sort of top of it being what you see. That is maybe where we might put our social network, or the aspects of it that we're aware of and consciously creating, but we have a lot of the same patterns happening in terms of the network and transport layer. All right. In a peer-to-peer context, probably the earliest version of what we might call a social network was the PGP Web of Trust, which some of you have heard of, and some of you have even been to a key signing party.
I was there.
Has anyone else been to a key signing party? Okay, cool. This was first invented in 1992 by a guy named Phil Zimmerman. And this is a diagram that's probably starting to look really familiar, of the users of a Linux group in Philadelphia. This is the first part of my PGP public key that you should realistically not use to contact me. But this is what it looks like. And what you do at a key signing party is people verify each other's identity. If I believe that your key is really you, I digitally sign it. And this is often done with a very specific protocol at events for this purpose. It's really hard to fully verify identity online, so people meet up in person. But the idea behind this whole web of trust thing is that over time, this web of signatures becomes stronger, there are more and more connections, they're more and more dense, and we can sort of build confidence in identity in a decentralized way. This is the exact protocol for a key signing party, which we do not have to read in its entirety, and it's actually really hard to read because the text highlighting doesn't show up on the slide. But I guess the things to note from it are there are various steps which are like be very careful with them. You prepare before the party, you verify keys in a certain way. At the party, there's a specific way that you like show each other your government ID. And then afterwards you go home and you do the actual signing portion. And though this is really carefully thought out and optimized, it's also really dependent on users being careful at every single point. There's a lot of, do it this way or it won't be secure in this other way. Which leads to criticism of PGP.
Wait, Sarah, do you mind just saying a little bit about what PGP is, how it's used, and a little bit more, just to give a little more context to the keys?
Mm-hmm. Who feels like they don't know what public key, private key cryptography is? Okay. It is a really early way of encrypting messages. And every user generates some keys. One is public, one is private. And the public key gets shared publicly, and the private one you ideally never show anybody. And you can use them to encrypt messages for a specific user, and also to sign them as being specifically from you. PGP is only one version of a public-private key cryptography algorithm. Actually, no, it uses several different algorithms too, possibly. It's one sort of protocol for doing this. And it stands for pretty good privacy.
Really?
Yes.
So American. It's pretty good.
Okay, I think that's the main points about what PGP is. Sorry.
I have one question actually. So at the party, why do you need somebody to actually verify you? Like what? You already have your key. You can just use it, right? But I didn't know why.
Yeah, it's this like trying to add an identity layer in. Trying to sort of be like this key really belongs to a person who has the identity that they're claiming they have. It depends what you want to use it for, actually. I think it's a really specific and interesting and open to criticism choice that involves real names, that it involves government ID, that all of these are really ideological choices that were made by the people who designed this whole protocol, right? And I think they're really up for criticism because you don't necessarily need that if you want to, depending on what you're trying to do. But I suppose that...
What are the use cases? Because like I used it before, but I never felt the need that I need to get verified, or I didn't even know that you can get verified. Or
Yeah, it's... I mean, I suppose if I didn't... If I have... I don't know. If I've generated like 100 keys and I'm trying to claim that they're all different people, and I'm trying to, be on a popular mailing list where something contentious is discussed, and I'm trying to be like, all these people are real, and you should listen to what we're saying, then it would be pretty challenging for me to get all 100 of those random keys I have signed by someone who is perceived as trustworthy in the community.
I see.
But if you are just sending an email to a friend who is very privacy conscious, maybe PGP isn't even the right thing for you to be using. But you could use PGP and you might not even care for your purposes. I have no signatures on my PGP key because I've used it to contact like 2 people. So it's not applicable in every case. It's just sort of like I mean, we'll get to a little bit more of the like things you can do and why you want what you can do with this web of trust thing. But you definitely don't need it for every use case.
I think Angie used it to contact the homeless dealer.
In the future.
Fun fact, Keybase, which we've all been using, is really basically doing what we're talking about now, too. Okay, so I just said, you might not even want to use P2P. Well, why? A few reasons. One, it's really old. When you install it, it defaults to a bunch of encryption standards, which are not, they're from the 90s, they're not really the ones that a cryptographer would recommend you actually use now. We have progressed as a science. And certain aspects of it, like the way it handles message authentication. So there's when we talked about public key, private key cryptography, we talked about encrypting a message for somebody and signing it as being from you. But there's also this third layer, which is like, how do we know the message didn't get swapped in the wire? And that's message authentication, particularly bad in P2P. And yeah, you can like configure it to not have any of these problems, but the average person doesn't.
Wait, so are those the 3 layers of cryptography when dealing with digital cryptography?
I'm not gonna like make some kind of taxonomy, but they're 3 really important things to think about when you're thinking about how you're encrypting something for who, yeah. So there are a lot of things which are easier. If you're just trying to message someone, you could use Keybase, you could use Signal, all of these things which are so much easier to install and actually use modern cryptography. The second one is connected and its bad user experience, which is a really important point. And was what I was trying to highlight with the whole, like, this is the key signing protocol. Like, this is what you do. You have to read this thing and check it carefully at every step. And then finally, PGP and the Web of Trust incentivizes the creation of long-term keys, which is pretty important for our context of talking about Web of Trust here. I want to try to disambiguate the concept of a Web of Trust from PGP as a protocol, partly for this reason. In PGP, you have a root key. And as you collect signatures, and people are sort of assigning you trust, you have a strong incentive to keep that key and keep using it. But in practice, this is kind of the exact opposite of what we want. We want you to, if you have even the slightest suspicion that your private key leaked, to get rid of it and never use it again. So, you know, like we have better primitives now. One might be a multi-sig that you can, you know, register new keys to and then remove the keys that you think might be compromised, like immediately. Or maybe even never reusing a key in this way. So anyway, in practice, key signing parties are often criticized as being security theater. People do not really accurately validate keys. Keys are distributed on centralized key servers, and even experts mess it up. Including me, the first time I did it at Bruner. And I was like trusting everyone, and then I was like, wait a minute. This is the wrong behavior. I'm not supposed to be trusting literally everyone I've met. Okay, cool. One of the ideas that comes out of PGP that is really useful is this idea of a strong set. And you might have come across this idea, again, if you have computer science or algorithms background, in terms of talking about finding the strongly connected components. To look at what that means, both of these clusters are strongly connected. And that means if I picked any 2 nodes in the network, I would be able to find a path between them, even though there might not be a direct one. Like, you know, there's only a connection going this way from this user, but if this user wanted to message this user, they still could with this path. And similarly, over here, if this user wants to message this user, they still can via this other user. And maybe it's helpful to look at a graph that is not strongly connected. So that'd be these 2 clusters. If anyone over here wants to message anyone up here, they can. And it doesn't matter how many connections go from the one side to the other. If there's no path back, it doesn't become strongly connected. And why is this useful? One of the things we can do with this concept of a seed set or a strong set is we can detect malicious rings that are working together. It's kind of what we talked about the mailing list where you make 100 identities. These bad actors can make as many accounts as they want. They can all trust each other. They can all upload each other's content, and they'll still be detectable because the density of bidirectional connections doesn't pass their sort of threshold. So to look at the graph we just saw, none of our actually legitimate users have trusted our malicious users, so it becomes very easy to sort them. It doesn't matter how many of them there are. This could be the same user spinning up hundreds of identities. What we call this in the context of peer-to-peer is a Sybil attack. Have you heard that term before? Some of you. Cool.
Some people haven't.
We will talk about it a little bit more then. It's something we kind of always have in a peer-to-peer context because we don't have much of a concept of trust or identity besides what we build using things like what we're talking about right now. We can't ever use the quantity of nodes signaling anything as a guarantee about what's happening in the network. It comes up, or if you've heard the term Sybil attack before, it might have been discussing blockchains. This is why we have proof of work in blockchains. And it's it has a different sort of form there, but the idea is that no one malicious actor, no matter how many sort of Bitcoin nodes they want to start on cloud servers around the world, won't be able to pay for enough computing power to solve hashes faster than the entire rest of the network indefinitely. Did that make sense? But in some contexts, a web of trust can also be this good defense because we have this sort of human layer of convincing people that you're real, which is actually sometimes hard to do. Hard enough to do. So just to return to PGP for one moment, the strong set is the largest connection of strongly connected PGP keys out there. Any two keys in the strong set have a path between them. There are islands or sets of keys that only sign each other and aren't linked to the strong set, and that's probably fine for the applications of the people using them. But if there is an island, only one member from the strong set needs to form a bidirectional trust relationship with the island in order to join it in. At the beginning of the year 2015, the strong set had about 55,000 keys in it. And interestingly, this is a graph of the number of signatures that any given key in the strong set has. And one of the findings of this analysis is that the strong set has the same distribution properties as a scale-free network, exhibiting this small little phenomenon. So this is just to say that that stuff that we were talking about earlier with graphs is applicable to the PGP web of trust.
What does that mean?
It means that some users have trusted a very significant percentage more other people, gone to way more key signing parties, enthusiastically verifying than others, and that it's some nodes are highly trusted or connected.
Which means if you were to take out those nodes, you would greatly affect the average.
Exactly. Yeah. And even that the strong set would start to maybe fracture and no longer be a 55,000 key mass.
Okay, and which also means that it's like it means that it's less vulnerable to attack.
It's more vulnerable to attack, but it's not as vulnerable to random people losing their keys.
Okay.
Yeah. Like if 5 random people in the strong set lose their keys, the chances of them being one of these big linking nodes is very small. But if you knew who the linking nodes were and you stole their keys, then this whole strong set business
loses its
is
power.
really going to start to break apart quickly.
Sorry, why is it's like in comparison with a centralized network? What is basically like this giant, massive, strong set? Is that's like harder to make you fail because it's just very big and it contains everything. That's why. Or is it because?
Are you asking what's the difference between a strong set and a centralized network?
Yeah, in terms of failing after an attack.
So, that's a great question because the answer is not particularly clear. Like, how do we define centrality, or like how centralized something is? How small does the subset of highly connected nodes have to be before we say that they're all, that the network has become centralized? The sort of classic model would be like you have one authority issuing identities, like the government giving you driver's licenses, and you're only allowed to be a citizen of one or two countries, and so you have this like really centralized sort of identity-giving body. But I guess in terms of network architectures, like it becomes really semantic, right? Like which dimension of the thing are we talking about being decentralized? Like Facebook has great uptime. We have servers all over the world. Like, are some of them routing more than their fair share of traffic? Like, yeah, probably. But you could also say that it's decentralized in that they're spread geographically around the world.
Yeah.
But they're highly centralized in terms of the sort of authority that governs how the network functions. So maybe that's a whole other presentation in a way. Like, what do you mean? Let me say, I do this presentation too.
That's very cool. Yeah.
So it's like, it's kind of complicated, but I mean, people say this, people criticize PGP and say the key servers are too centralized, for example. So it's debatable. Okay, onward. When we're talking about social networks in a peer-to-peer context, I think the most important protocol to talk about is Secure Scuttlebutt, which some of you have used. Who has used Secure Scuttlebutt? I know you have. You have. Cool. Like a lot of us. Great. So maybe y'all already know this part. Scuttlebutt or Secure Scuttlebutt or SSB is the underlying protocol. Its logo is a hermit crab. And there are many clients who use to interact with it. Some of the most popular are probably Patchwork is the most popular one, which is this one here. Patch Bay is this one. Patch Fox is a browser extension client. There's an Android client. So anyway, many clients, one protocol, which is something that we see a lot in the context of the BitTorrent network, which is my secret favorite peer-to-peer network. We have many clients interacting with the same network, similar to a blockchain, some more spammy than others. And if you take a closer look at Patchwork, which is a desktop client, it's the one I use, this is my profile. There are a bunch of really familiar aspects that you might encounter from the world of social media UIs. Profile photo, friends list, but you will see underneath my username, my public key. So it is using, my public key is actually my public identity. This is how posts are being verified as sent from me, and basically is my username. Also, you can't really see here, but in SSB, trust is directed, which is to say that you can only see my friends, but if you were to scroll down here, there's a section for followers, who are people I don't follow back, and following, who are people who do not follow me back. And like many peer-to-peer protocols, SSB is local first, or alternatively offline first. So like Laura complained about in our first meetup, that she installed SSB and started filling up her hard drive. You are hosting content locally in a hidden folder in your root partition called the .ssb folder. And the protocol is doing all of this while you're using SSB beneath the surface. It's requesting content from peers and in turn replying to their requests, or as we say, scuttling. And one of the reasons for this is that we have no real concept of servers, of course, so you have to be replying to requests, but there's also sort of an ideological motivation that I think is quite funny in the Scuttlebutt context. A lot of the people who were sort of early in creating Scuttlebutt live on boats. There's like a really statistically significant boat community on SSB. So people were actually offline for like big portions of time, and they wanted to write their posts and, interact with it and then connect to the network when they got to the land, which I just think is so lovely. One of the downsides, of course, of this type of architecture is that peers aren't connected all the time. So we have these things called pubs. Pubs are peers, just like ordinary peers that follow back. You can see that I am connected to some of them down in the bottom corner. So they're not really privileged in any way, but they do have this feature where they issue invite codes. If you have an invite code, the pub will follow you back. And this is important for reasons we're going to get to in a couple slides. These pubs we might think of as these highly connected nodes that characterize a small world network. Fun fact, SSB is so offline first that you can scuttle on a plane, and I did. This is me and my friend Lars. Really, really blurry photo of us connected to each other. This is me showing you the screen on a network that we just made on a plane. And maybe even from plane to plane, if you want to get really creative. This is like one of the most hilarious like subsets of distributed computing to me is like people researching how to connect a mesh net from plane to plane. Anyway, real area of research. Cool. Scuttlebutt is an example of a gossip protocol. Actually, the word scuttlebutt means gossip in pirate slang. And there's a pretty big variety of gossip protocols. Basically, all it means is that in contrast to a centralized approach, or one where every node speaks to every other node in the network, messages are sort of bounced around depending on who happens to be online. And there's a lot of different types of gossip protocols, so I'm not going to try to characterize them too specifically. One of the fun facts about SSB is that most posts are plain text and public. It does have this concept of private messages though, private being in this case encrypted, but not sent to you in any meaningful way. So when you send a private message on SSB, it gets bounced around by the gossip protocol through the network. Like anyone you know is going to receive it, and every node when it receives a private message just tries to decrypt it, and if it succeeds, it's like, oh, this is a message for me. But like everyone is receiving your private messages. It's kind of like, I like that. Okay. And I also like thinking about gossip in a social network, or to return to sort of an anthropological context. This is a graph from an anthropology paper talking about an originator passing gossip around. And as the gossip is passed around in the social network, the relationships between all parties involved in the gossiping are strengthened. Gossip has utility, gossip builds social ties, and gossip is an important part of setting social norms. And this is a quote from Extra Statecraft. Scott identifies rumor and gossip as tools of aggression amongst the powerless. The servant gossips about the master. The underlings can, with anonymity, stir up public opinion about the boss. Gossip, he writes, never starts anywhere, the linguistic equivalent and forerunner of witchcraft. It magically multiplies without attribution and cannot be contained. It is a technique of infrapolitics, the invisible suburban territory of subordinate groups. In this way, gossip and rumors are similar to disguises, tricks, and the art of the weak. Which I quite liked thinking about in terms of, as we build alternatives and why we might be building alternatives. Another writer says, just to really go off topic, hatred of gossip is hatred of women talking to each other. So it has a political history. Which we will now return to a peer-to-peer context. Anyway, so Secure Scuttlebutt is a database protocol, this is from their docs, for unforgeable append-only message feeds. Unforgeable means that I'm signing all of my posts with my own key. This is how my identity is enforced. But let's talk about the append-only message feed thing. This is something that you might be familiar with from the world of blockchains as well. What happens is we take the hash of my last post, we include it in my current post, which I then sign, and then we take the hash of that post, and et cetera, et cetera. So we sort of have this like linked list type thing going on of all of my posts. I think it's really interesting to think of SSB, or like something which is in some ways so ideologically different from blockchains, as being just a bunch of personal blockchains that are all syncing through a social graph. But one of the fun things about Scuttlebutt that we sort of looked at a little bit with all the different clients is this sort of message content. In a blockchain, this would be a list of transaction hashes, and it would be like very highly ordered. In Scuttlebutt, it can be anything. Anything can go in this blob, and if a client doesn't know how to display the type of thing that is in that blob, it just won't display it. So consequently, we have this like renaissance of SSB clients out there, which I just kind of think are fun. So this is calendar-like SSB client. This is a SSB client specifically for viewing and posting book reviews. I don't even know what this one is for, but it has a really cool UI. Some people play chess on Scuttlebutt using the Scuttlebutt protocol. And of course, it has a CLI client. So, you know, like people use this protocol for things that are not social media networks as well, because actually it's just this like append-only list of arbitrary message blobs. And we've talked about this a little bit as well, but in the SSB social graph, this is how content syncs. You sync and store the content of everyone you're friends with, everyone your friends are friends with. But what you store is always sort of relative to your place in the network. So it will happen sometimes where you're browsing and you can't read a whole thread because one of the participants in the thread is too many hops outside of your social graph and you just can't see them. This is all configurable. And depending on your client, it might have different defaults. But one thing I think is very interesting as well is that you're always storing even more than you can see. So your client will only visualize several hops out, but you're storing actually farther than your client will even display to you. Filling up your root partition. And I like this framework for thinking about Scuttlebutt and indeed other peer-to-peer protocols. DAT is another one. Some protocols we can think of as chosen content from any peers. Whereas with SSB, we choose our peers and we accept their content no matter what it is. BitTorrent is also chosen content any peers. IPFS, if you've come across that one, is similarly chosen content any peers. So Scuttlebutt doesn't use PGP signatures, but it is kind of similar, and we can think of it as a web of trust. It has similar properties. This is a visualization of this sort of what the community sort of calls the main Scuttlebutt continent. And this is Dominic, who you will come across very quickly if you spend time on SSB, the most connected node creator of Scuttlebutt. And he's not highlighted here because he's the creator or anything like that. It's just he's been around for a long time, so he's connected to the most people. But of course, we can end up with little islands, and this is showing one. So beyond what we can see in this graph, we could have like a second continent even, but from the version or the perspective of the person whose data set this came from, it's not visible. And we're going to talk about a specific island a little bit down the line. And you can do similar things with these peer-to-peer webs that you can do with social network predictive policing. Thank you. So this is from a paper on de-anonymizing Bitcoin. And this is the amount of private keys owned by various entities who are known, and who has transacted with who, because this is actually all visible. And so you can see that addresses belonging to the Silk Road dark market are all identifiable, as well as everyone who has transacted with them. And in many cases, we don't know the real name of that person or whose Bitcoin address is. Bitcoin is pseudonymous. But there are these sort of onboarding and offboarding ramps, which are exchanges or places where people do identify themselves. Maybe they also have an account with an email address tied to it. And you can sort of see how many hops away that person is from the drug marketplace. And this information is put into practice. So a few years ago, one of the oldest and largest cryptocurrency exchanges called BTCE had its servers seized by the US government. And one of the reasons people think they did this, though it's not necessarily public, is that one of BTC's operators, Alexander Vinnick, had been linked to the theft of Bitcoin from Mt. Gox. Has anyone heard of what I'm talking about? Okay, you should know that the first Bitcoin trading exchange was originally a Magic the Gathering trading card exchange site that was really famously hacked in the first Bitcoin bubble in like 2014 or 15. And mostly, I just think it's worth knowing that it started off as a Magic the Gathering trading site.
And it was called Mt. Gox?
Mount Gox. Yeah.
Was it
Sorry?
Magic. What was it?
Magic the Gathering.
Magic.
It's
It's a card game.
Oh, okay.
yeah, it's like a collectible trading card game that's like really popular, but also just like a really unlikely origin story, I guess. Yeah.
Wait, so it was a Magic the Gathering trading
Yeah,
website?
like before it was a Bitcoin exchange, they was like selling your Magic cards, and
And then it became selling Bitcoin.
then it became a Bitcoin exchange, and then it was hacked.
Wow.
Yeah, but actually I have a friend into this and you spend lots of money on these cards. It's quite like impressive if you don't know. I mean, it's like it's a real market.
Oh,
I mean, it's a proper thing. It's not like some like stupid game.
No,
So,
it's big. I
just to
haven't.
make it for
Oh no,
everyone.
of course.
They
It's like
don't know.
it's funny, but it's like definitely a big thing, and people spend a lot of money. And one of my friends is like a champion. Like people have professional careers playing Magic cards. It's like a thing. This is not what this lecture is about, but it's fun. Okay, so anyway, what's going on here?
The reason they shut down BTC.
Yeah, I just need to figure a graph. So WizSec, Bitcoin Security Specialist, published this. And this is the Bitcoin stolen from the exchange. And this is the exchange that was shut down. So you see that it's like one hop, very closely connected, and people suspect that it's tied. So, and then the exchange got shut down like really like very shortly after. So.
Wait, Sarah, do you mind explaining this graph
Mhm.
again?
Mm-hmm. So when I send my Bitcoin to someone, so this is the exchange wallet over here, and this is the stolen Bitcoin. It's like this Bitcoin was sent to one address before it was deposited in the exchange. So each sort of bar is an address. And some of them are like kind of getting reused, but the most hops you have here is like 2. So I guess people were asserting or suspecting that the exchange knew that they had this Bitcoin and were sort of part of it. It's conjecture, it's definitely conjecture, but it's kind of interesting to see how you can trace a theft like this through a network and sort of guess how far away, like you know the person you're sending money to, so the thief knows all of these people who have accounts on this exchange, so the exchange knows the identity of all these people who know the thief, right? Yeah.
Does that mean that Bitcoin works well for how it was taught? That you can like be able to look and trace what's happening in the chain? Is that like a proof of the theory behind it?
I mean, Bitcoin is definitely designed with this as a known thing, but I think especially in the early days of Bitcoin, people didn't understand what was public about what they were doing. And I think that the average Bitcoin user still doesn't understand that you can just do this, make this chart of anything that happens on the Bitcoin network. And I think that the same thing is true of most peer-to-peer protocols. Like, I'm not even sure that the average user of SSB knows that everything they write is plain text immutably stored on like the computers of everyone they know forever. But like Bitcoin especially marketed itself as being like anonymous, but I guess when something describes itself as anonymous, you actually have to ask like what is identity, and you know, and it's also kind of interesting because like as this network continues for longer and longer, more and more people in it are identified at some sort of offboarding and onboarding point. Like there was a time when almost no one had done that thing that many cryptocurrency exchanges ask you to do, where you like scan your passport and you email it to them, but that's like very common now. And so back then, we maybe didn't imagine that as much of the network could be connected to real identities as is. And I guess, I don't know, I think that more people should understand what is public about Bitcoin. Yeah. Like, if you ever bought drugs on Silk Road, like, it's never going away. Like, it's gonna be public forever.
That's how they got him. Do you know that when they found the guy who did Silk Road, it was I guess he like signed on to a message board, and he was a little bit. It was like he did 2 posts or something, really tiny. But they basically like combed and combed and combed until they found some kind of overlap, and then they were like, "We think it might be this guy." And that's how I read this.
Yeah, I didn't know the Silk Road story, but yeah.
But like just this tiny little, you're not thinking, and then if someone's looking, they can find it.
That's really on the Silk Road guy.
This is the final section, and this has gone on longer than that, by the way. So I hope that you're all still with me. What we can do with trust. We've talked about a few examples. Let's talk about a few more. This has already come up a little bit, but to make it explicit, I think 2 of the main things we get out of trust are trust as identity and trust as reputation. And these are interconnected, they're arguably the same thing. I'm not sure we can have identity without implicitly having reputation. But we might want to do different things with them. This is another example of a web of trust diagram that you're probably very familiar with looking at by now in this presentation. This one is from a project called Dunitor. Dunitor is a blockchain-based universal basic income. It mints a token called June to everyone who's inside its web of trust. And the reason it uses this web of trust is because a universal basic income that's minting currency to people needs a concept of identity. How do I know you're not collecting your universal basic income twice? In Dunitor, the way they do that is that in order to connect, you need to be part of their strong set, and you need to be part of their strong set with a density of 5 connections. Which is actually pretty hard to do. I went to Toulouse, where they're based, for a weekend. I could not get 5, I could only get 1. So everyone within the strong set gets the token minted at regular intervals, and they also gain the privilege to mint blocks on the network, which is sort of the secondary nice thing about this protocol, is that they use this web of trust to allow their proof of work mining to not be very energy intensive. They have a concept of identity, so it doesn't matter what hash rate you afford them. A question that comes out of it, of course, that I don't even know the answer to, is why they need proof of work at all if their concept of identity is sufficiently strong. I would love to ask them. Circles, the project I work on with Sarah Spluffy, is very similar, except every user in the network gets their own currency, which sort of stays tied to their identity in a way. And then they form trust connections with their peers. And once they've formed a trust connection, they exchange their currency with that peer at a 1-to-1 ratio. You might find yourself asking, if I can only exchange 1-to-1 with people who I trust, I don't have a lot of liquidity, or my spending power is very bad. But we also have a concept of transitive trust. So in transitive trust, we sort of pass tokens through the network. So let's not talk about that graph too much, but like if I trust Kiwako, but I don't trust Laura for whatever reason, but you two both trust each other, and I'm trying to pay Laura, I send my token to Kiwako, who sends her token to Laura. So we've all ended up with tokens that we trust. In effect, Laura has received however many tokens I'm trying to send. Yeah. Our trust graph is actually weighted also, which we will not talk about here. And this is sort of a similar, there are a couple protocols who use Web of Trust for identity in a similar way. One is called Trust Lines, also a blockchain-based protocol, also uses Web of Trust like ours. And one is called Bright ID, which is more specifically trying to be an identity app. To descend a little bit more to the protocol level, not a lot of people know this, but I think it's very cool. Your BitTorrent client is keeping internal reputation scores for peers all the time. As you're seeding or leeching from them, it's choking nodes, that is the term they use, choking, a little violent, that don't seem to be seeding as much as they're leeching. Is everyone comfortable with the term seeding and leeching? No?
Oh yeah, I sorry.
You do not?
I know the terms. Caution.
Do you have another question?
No.
Okay. If you want to read at more depth about sort of incentives and reputation in BitTorrent, there's a paper called Incentives to Build Robustness in BitTorrent. Kazaa, if any of you remember Kazaa, some of you are old enough to remember Kazaa too. It had peer points that you earned if you shared content, and if you received a lot of them, you could trade them in for prizes. Some of these early BitTorrent reputation systems actually went as far as to try and layer currencies into them, which I think is kind of a fascinating precedent for what's going on now with currency marketplaces. And I think maybe reputation in torrent communities was best formalized in private torrent communities, which were admittedly centralized trackers, but they were also really highly optimized and really effective at incentivizing certain types of user behavior. So I'm not sure if any of you remember Oink's Pink Palace. This is my favorite private torrent tracker from the 90s.
What would you torrent on Wink?
Music. This was really before we torrented movies. See, this is getting recorded. I would never do such a thing. The only thing I've ever torrented is Linux distros.
With sign key, just to verify.
And one of the things that these networks did that I think is interesting is that bad behavior, or there's the social graph, bad behavior reflected back through it. So if you invited a user who did not maintain a proper seeding and leeching ratio, like your ratio would also suffer. You're sort of liable for everyone you onboard to the system. To look at how we might build a more granular trust connection, so far we've talked about the web of trust. Mostly it's binary, like I trust you or I don't trust you. But this is maybe not how we experience trust in real life. I don't trust everyone equally, certainly. So we might want our protocol, our web of trust, to weight trust. So my me here, I have different trust scores for these people. And then as this web gets built out, we think about how in real life social networks and on some of the platforms we've talked about, trust is transitive. We saw this in the context of circles and actually private torrent communities. So if my network looks like this, you might want to extend trust from the central user to the more peripheral users. And then if the central user is trying to figure out how much to trust these users on the outside, we could weight the trust for the users on the outside by the trust for the user that it passes through. So we can sort of like build or infer trust scores moving throughout the network. And maybe this peer wants to reach a third level out. It could, hop a little further. If this graph were bigger, we can imagine maybe that there would be some maximum number of hops that we would make before we've seen the entire network. And we have the sort of perfect trust score for a user.
So quick question, so just like, if my trust went down with one user, does that decrease in trust between me and that user impact others' users, like interaction or trust within that poorly acting user? Or does it usually only affect the one-to-one interaction?
It would sort of depend on how you've designed your web of trust protocol. But here, because I don't have, in general, for the algorithm I'm describing here, it definitely would. So like, I don't trust this user perfectly, and this user really barely trusts this user at all. So my trust is even lower. Whereas here, this user trusts this user perfectly, so I've just extended this trust. I may have got my math wrong here, but I don't think I did. Whereas, if there were more coming out here, because I have said, this user is a great peer, I'm going to trust them a lot, like these ones will need to But then maybe, you know, if this graph is really big, like maybe we have more connections coming from here, right?
Yeah.
And maybe one of them has said, oh, this perfect peer, like I only trust this perfect peer point 2. They sent me a bad packet. And in that case, maybe I would redo my calculation in lieu of the network. This is actually like where this is going is that if we walk this whole graph and we weight all of the trust scores across it, it actually converges to a global trust score. Yes.
I have an idea. I was thinking, like, what if I actually don't trust this one, not that much at all, and then the node that I don't trust doesn't trust also the another node, that one. Does that mean then I can maybe trust the node that the node that I don't? So the node that doesn't trust, that I don't trust, and doesn't trust another node, that means that I will trust the node, the one. Or
You can still transitively transact with that node.
So I guess in this model here of weighted trust,
Oh.
there's really no concept of not trust because not trust would be just 0 here. So if I so say for example, I didn't trust this node, this is a 0, then my score for this node would also be a 0. But I could assign it a different score myself based on my own experiences with it. Or say there's a connection here between this peer and this peer. So this is 0, this is 0, this is 1, this node trusts this node also 1, then, you know, my sort of weighted trust calculation, if I'm doing this correctly, off the top of my head, would be 5 for this node. As a sort of split if the one trust connection is 0 and the one trust connection is 1. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, mostly. But do they actually have like one kind of protocol on how to do this trust weight thing, or is there like a popular one?
I am in fact getting this from a paper. That's one of the coming slides. But you could do this many ways. We'll get there. In this particular thing that I'm talking about, if we walk the whole network, we're going to converge on a global trust score for every user. And kind of interestingly or nicely, because of this, we don't have to traverse the whole network to get a global trust score. Probabilistically speaking, we traverse a certain number of hops based on the size of the network, like k of n hops, and we end up with enough probability that we've gotten the global trust score. And then we can sort of use this. Some things to be careful about with this are, nodes can't store or compute their own trust score. We can't trust them. They could be malicious. Kind of also interestingly, we have to be pretty careful about how we normalize these trust scores because as a node, I could set arbitrarily high trust scores, for example, of like 100 for my other malicious peers. And so on and so on, sort of attack vectors within the peer-to-peer space. But this is just sort of like one way that we might sort of look at building reputation scores across a network like this one. And yes, I'm talking about a specific paper, which you can read in more depth if you're interested. This one is called Eigentrust, which is really influential, but to my knowledge, never implemented in any BitTorrent network. And it's proposing a secure way to calculate global trust scores for every user in the network. These were its design criteria, which I think are really helpful and sort of summarize like a bunch of the things you have to think about. The first one being the system should be self-policing and not relying on one authority to give trust scores or calculate trust scores. Every user should be able to calculate or verify them on their own. In the paper, they say they want the system to maintain anonymity. I think that's really interesting. What do you mean by anonymity, right? Because we talked about that a little bit. For them, that means a username is fine, but an IP address would reveal your identity. There should be no profit to newcomers. This is kind of like a very interesting aspect of reputation systems. If I were to end up with negative reputation, I would just delete my account and make a new one. So, we can't assign any benefit to doing that. Basically, newcomers have to start at the bottom. It has to be minimal computational overhead, even for a large graph. You have to actually be able to do these calculations. And finally, it has to be robust to a malicious collective of peers. And it does that with a seed set. So I thought this really good summary of like, you know, even still from like whenever this paper came out, like 2002, still very applicable. And this is a whole sort of family of research. So there are many other ways of calculating this type of thing, different protocols which are maybe similar or slightly different in implementation details, but also do this sort of type of trust calculations. PageRank is actually one of them, centralized in the form of Google, but very similar. It's using inbound links as a trust metric, and who the inbound link is coming from is significant because some authorities, because you know, a link from a more trusted authority bumps your score more. Appleseed and Advogado are similar, if you're interested. And we might sort of characterize these approaches to using trust in computing across a couple different metrics, sort of global versus local. Am I interested in reputation as it exists globally in the network, or am I interested in reputation as it exists locally from my specific view? Of course, centralized, decentralized, we already talked about. I thought this one was interesting. Policy-based versus reputation-based. I guess meaning a policy would be if you meet these established criteria or send me the correct credentials, I will trust you. If you show me your ID, I will trust you. If you send me packets regularly, I will trust you. Or reputation-based, which sort of uses the entire history of your actions to compute trust. This is also including sort of transitive trust. And, you know, I think if we want to get creative, we could sort of imagine further parameters. Like perhaps we have a BitTorrent network where I want to think about sort of multidimensional trust. Maybe I trust you to seed adequately and not overleach, but I don't necessarily trust you to recommend good music. Or maybe I trust you not to share fake political news, but you also post a lot of not safe for work content. Which brings me to the final section of this presentation, which is we've talked about trust and how we might model it in computing, but maybe let's reflect a little bit on the why from an anthropological perspective again. This tweet, who's heard of the ENS?
It's like
DNS on Ethereum. Yeah. This is a distributed name server on Ethereum. And this tweet is a bot that tweets out whenever anyone registers a .eth domain name. And this one was in July 2017. And someone was registering stormfront.eth, and if you don't know, Stormfront was like this really popular Nazi message board. And I think this is very significant because this particular tweet was registered just weeks before GoDaddy, Google, CloudFront, and Network Solutions canceled the accounts of Stormfront and another site called Daily Stormer. So this was like kind of a big event on the internet in the decentralization community. I don't know if any of you paid attention to it or it came up in your news circle. But Cloudflare wrote this blog post sort of explaining what they did, why they chose to do it, and actually also like why this is a really dangerous thing to do and they should be very careful about doing things like this. It's a really interesting post. I think that the first sentence here is maybe like the perfect explanation for why some amount of decentralization is good. Our terms of service reserve the right for us to terminate users of our network at our sole discretion. So this is often something we speak about as being bad in the peer-to-peer community. Yet this specific action undertaken at this time was very popular, even in the decentralization community. And so I think it's kind of interesting to think to what extent a protocol might have a politics. So I'd like to think about this as a kind of heuristic. The extent to which we allow content moderation sort of takes away from our censorship resistance. We have, like, when we're designing a protocol, this imaginary slider that we have to put somewhere. And, you know, there are trade-offs at every sort of place that we might locate it. Which is not really to say that content moderation equals censorship. It's just that at the level of the protocol, it's either literally possible to remove content or not. For example, on the BitTorrent network, I could choose not to seed a specific file, but it can't be removed. Maybe related, this is a Twitter bot that tracks the trading activity of known or suspected neo-Nazis on the Bitcoin network. Another example, different subject, This is a poll asking, would you stop hosting your Ethereum full node if you find out there's child porn encoded in blockchain? And you know, there are mixed responses here. And fun fact, actually there is child porn in blockchain, in the Bitcoin blockchain. I read a study about it. 17 links to child porn websites and 1 actual image. Maybe similar but very different protocol. There's a far-right pub on Secure Scuttlebutt. And like we discussed earlier, content syncs through this sort of social graph, so an island can form that is isolated from the rest of the continent. And this pub is specifically isolationist, so they warn their users not to follow other pubs because their feed will be polluted, like extremely white supremacist language, right? But when an island does happen to connect, like someone joins, you can trace the path of that connection. You can sort of see how it got there through this social graph. And this is the thread of people who suddenly saw these posts and are tracing how they got there and sort of mobilizing in a guerrilla way to like re-isolate the island, which is very interesting to read and follow. And then again, sort of on the Scuttlebutt community, there's a lot of discussion about what features might be built into the protocol or into the clients of the protocol to sort of deal with this type of phenomenon when it comes. Some users have, you know, a lot of different perspectives, of course. Some users are like, not only do I want to block this person, I realize that I'm hosting some of their content in my own local database and I want to delete it. I hate that this is on my computer. And you know, other people are different perspectives. So the SSB protocol sort of put its slider in a different place than, for example, the Bitcoin network, where we all share the exact same data and I can't really remove any chunk of it. And it's in part because it has this concept of a web of trust that is leveraged to shape the ways that content flows through the network. This is a visualization of who is blocked and who does the blocking in SSB. So over here is who is blocked, and over here is who does the blocking. And I think it's really interesting mostly to note that certain people are disproportionately blocked, and certain people disproportionately block. So the size of the nodes and numbers, like some people are doing a lot more sort of moderating than others.
How does that practically happen in Scuttlebutt? Like, who is designated as a moderator?
Anyone can block whoever they want.
Anyone.
You can just block some.
Yeah, but it's all public, so you can sort of aggregate what's been done in the visualization like this one.
So what happens if you are totally blocked? Are you not able to use it? You can only use it if you at least have one connection.
Yes.
Well, I think, sorry, you can
What
like still
happened?
post, but nobody receives your.
Got
Yes.
it.
Right?
Yes, that's a more technically correct answer
Nice.
than mine.
So yeah.
And if you convince one friend to join, you can see each other's posts, but no one else will see. Okay, so just because we have a web of trust and the ability to block people doesn't actually make content moderation easy. There are lots of platforms we can block people and we still have lots of problems. And we can kind of turn back to the centralized web for some examples of why. So we look at Twitter, which everyone from really every political community likes to say is this sort of horrible bastion of harassment and simultaneously censorship. In 2014, there's a thing called Gamergate, which was a pretty big harassment campaign. And a bunch of features were developed at that time to do things like automatically block anyone who was blocked by somebody else. Shared block lists were made. And so, you know, this is a feature that there's some precedent for. It's been discussed to be implemented in SSB, but I don't think it has been. It's also been discussed to be implemented in Mastodon, which is a decentralized Twitter alternative, federated Twitter alternative. But this is from a thread in the Mastodon GitHub about block lists, which I think is kind of interesting because it complicates this picture and is describing how block lists themselves can become a method of harassment. So we have these list makers who aren't accountable. They sneak 1 or 2 people into the list based on their biases or personal vendettas. This person is saying, every communal block list on Twitter or Mastodon so far has ended up being weaponized by bigots or other bad actors. I know this type of feature might seem like a useful tool for protecting women and minorities from harassment at first glance, but in practice, shared block lists are used to isolate, harass, and abuse the most vulnerable. So, maybe not as transparently good or simply good as we might imagine.
So the practice is you sneak someone onto the block list, or
The thing is, I think that these lists get big, and once they get big, it's not possible to actually audit the list in any kind of meaningful way. You have like 1,000 people on a list. Who knows who put them there and why? And it's no longer personal. So it gets to the point where no one can read the whole thing, and that's just a very messy situation. And I think that we can kind of like recall the history of putting humans on lists that we don't like and publishing them, and this is not like a particularly good history. You might think about the McCarthy era Hollywood blacklist. And also I think it's quite interestingly, this whole idea of like shared block lists come up from every corner of the political spectrum, against every corner of the political spectrum. So in my country, we have a famous YouTuber named Jordan Peterson, who was making one of Marxist intellectuals at a university recently. Sort of weaponized lists. Okay. And I also want to point out, because I love to dig into our history, is that these questions of how we moderate content and how we deal with online harassment are as old as anything you might even call the internet.
Sorry, what was the last thing about Jordan Peterson? I didn't understand.
Oh, he was making a like blacklist of academics in Toronto, of like Marxist intellectuals or something like that.
Oh, he was making blacklists.
What's that?
I didn't know he was making blacklists. That's
Yeah,
interesting.
it was like a thing a couple years ago. And I'm not sure it actually went anywhere. But I think that, like some of my friends were like, to not spiral into it, it's like people were like attending classes they weren't from to be like, yes, this professor is a Marxist, this professor isn't a Marxist. And then I think that some of the other professors complained that they felt stalked by these people showing up to their classes to put them on this list. It may be reasonable of them. Anyway, the idea of the block list goes back to Usenet, which I'm not sure if any of you remember, but like Usenet is a bulletin board system from before the internet as we might know it. This is a Usenet kill file, or a list of posts that you choose not to replicate for various reasons. There was a lot of harassment on Usenet. It's where the term flame war comes from. So these things, they've been with us since the history of communication networks, since their origin, really. And finally, to give maybe an example of the same phenomenon on a network level, they're also a thing in the BitTorrent community. Here are some subscribable block lists that you can configure your BitTorrent client to disallow. And these are mostly organizations that try to police file sharing. You can block the US government or anti-copyright infringement, etc. So this is also a thing there. And I guess just to wrap up, there is a whole wave of startups looking at whether we can leverage these kinds of reputation systems for combating social issues like fake news. Some examples being Steemit, Civil, and Relevant. These are all young, have various degrees of success. But it's interesting to see what will happen and what evolutions will come in the world of peer-to-peer reputation systems. I think that it's also worth remembering constantly, if that's not totally hammered home at this point, worth being cautious about because humans optimize for what we measure, and these are measuring new things in some cases. Social media networks, as we experience them, have already shaped our behavior and simultaneously been used for new forms of surveillance. One could argue the entire fake news problem was created by social media networks changing and decentralizing the information landscape. So, in conclusion, we have talked about some things we can do with trust in computing, how we might model trust in computing, what a web of trust looks like in a peer-to-peer network, and maybe sort of in a bigger step up what a social network is even in an anthropological context. Thanks.
Now I have